We have been working with Toronto and will continue to do so with Toronto and other communities across the country, obviously proposing stronger legislation with respect to firearms, particularly background checks, which may have been a relevant consideration here, bearing in mind the references to mental health.
That's Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale on Power and Politics this week. Many are calling for stricter gun laws after that deadly shooting in Toronto. That includes the City of Toronto. They will ask Ottawa to ban the sale of handguns within city limits. So let's get back to our Sunday Scrum and see what they have to say about this. John is in Ottawa, Vicky's on Skype. Vicky, I'll begin with you. What do you make of this call to ban handguns altogether? Will it in fact reduce violence in the city?
I don't know that it would. I don't know that it would work because we still have a massive problem where guns come in unregistered and largely illegal from the United States, and we haven't figured out a way to exactly curb that problem. So the sale of handguns deals with legally purchased handguns. However, that's not necessarily the problem we're facing in Toronto. We're also focusing on the machine and not necessarily all the structures behind gun violence. And so we're not seeing much more of a commitment from the city around housing, a little bit of more of a commitment, but not as robust as we'd like to see around youth initiatives, around gun safety education, around any number of tools, including parental support for people who know that their kids maybe have a predilection to violence or are having some difficulties. We are not seeing any more supports in that direction. We're instead focusing on a single item, which is the gun that's involved, and we're not looking at how victims and families process these events.
What do you think, John? Do bans work?
This is one area where I think reasonable opinion on both the left and the right can come together. It is impossible, simply impossible, for that young man to have illegally acquired that handgun. It is incredibly difficult to illegally acquire a handgun in Canada. You have to go through 3 or 4 different licenses, depending on whether you're doing it for the first time or acquiring a new one. You can only have that handgun demonstrably, provably, as part of, say, an antique collection, or because you like to take target practice at a gun range. Oh, by the way, another permit required to take that gun to the gun range. So he would not have passed the incredibly strict screening measures needed to hire a handgun legally. Neither is there any objective evidence that I have seen, and I've been looking for a couple of days now, that we have a genuine problem where these handguns, which cannot be used for self-defense, they have to be locked away very securely in your home. So they are almost impossible to steal. We have no evidence then that stolen, legally acquired handguns are involved in many or indeed any crimes at all. There is overwhelming evidence that these handguns are brought across the border illegally. So on the one hand, yes, we have to be stricter. We have to look for new methods of technology. We have to tighten the laws for trying to smuggle handguns across the border, make that act of smuggling one of the most serious offenses that exist in the criminal code. And by the way, look for where those guns are probably coming across and prosecute regardless of where that might be geographically. And I agree with Vicky as well. In this case, did this family have sufficient access to mental health resources for a young man who, from the time he was a teenager, was clearly deeply, seriously mentally ill? Could there have been more done to keep him from becoming violent? Those are the questions we have to ask.
Well, nevertheless, the Parliament, when they get back from their summer session, their summer break, and get back in the fall, they are pushing forward with a new agenda, specifically around gun control, gun reform legislation in the form of Bill C-71. So just quickly, that includes provisions to enhance existing background checks for those seeking firearms licenses, as well as new mandatory record-keeping practices for vendors. But based on what the two of you are saying, it doesn't sound like it would make much of a difference for the gun violence that may exist within the various cities in this country. John.
You know, I think that's perfectly. I think it's perfectly true that the Liberals are forever putting forward legislation that would modestly restrict further the already incredibly strict rules surrounding gun possession in Canada, because there is a wing within the progressive movement that would basically like to see the elimination of firearms from the country entirely. The Conservatives, who have within their base a group of people who own guns, either recreationally or farmers or hobbyists, believe that their fundamental rights are being infringed. So both sides get to gin up their base over gun control issues. And I honestly believe if the Liberals proceed with further restrictions on firearm use. They're just doing it for crass partisan political purposes, and the Conservatives will oppose it for crass partisan political purposes as well.
Vicki, final word to you.
I think that if we're looking at reform around guns, we have to have a whole picture of what happens, from who purchases the gun, whether legally or illegally, to who fires the gun, to who is impacted by these guns. And so what C-71 doesn't do, again, is it doesn't have that whole picture in mind. It doesn't deal with, educating 5-year-olds on the dangers of guns, because we know that there are kids who grow up in households that have guns. It doesn't do anything to, talk to kids about, like, what are the ramifications for purchasing and owning and being found with an illegal handgun or similar types of weapons. We don't have any of that in C-71. We're focusing on enforcement, which is more to do with police and, vendors who have to engage with police, but we're not dealing with a whole community that's affected by gun violence. We're seeing massive expansion of gun violence in cities that are not just Toronto. It's happening in Halifax, it's happening in Regina, it's happening in North Battleford. We're seeing it all over the country, but none of the federal legislation that we're seeing actually deals with some of the consequences or ramifications and isn't dealing with the Canadian community as a whole.
Okay, we'll leave the discussion there. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Natasha.
It's another edition of the Sunday Scrum. John Ibbotson with the Globe and Mail, and Vicki Machama is with Star Metro. Now, if you missed today's Sunday Scrum, you can head to the website. We've got you covered. You can go to CBCNews.ca and click on the video tab. That'll take you to the CBC player. Then you search for Scrum, and you can find all the latest episodes. You're watching CBC News Network.